Mike Bickle loves to tell stories.
And that's really all I do when I go to prayer meetings, and I tell stories.
More specifically, Mike Bickle loves to tell stories about all of the amazing prophecies God gave to him and his followers in the 1980s.
The Lord was confirming this movement in its early days.
Prophecies which he says were confirmed in incredible, miraculous ways that no man could have manipulated.
It was a sign in the heavens that no man could have manipulated. It was spoken publicly for all to hear.
But if we compare the way Mike told those stories in the 80s versus the way he tells those same stories today, we can see that there clearly has been quite a bit of manipulation.
And I was a little bit mystified by that. Some years later, it would make a lot more sense.
One of Mike's favorite stories is the vision of the white horse that the Kansas City prophet Bob Jones claimed God gave him on August 8, 1982. This was one of the first prophecies Bob Jones gave to Mike when they first met in the spring of 1983. Here's how Mike told that story in 1986, just 3 years after it occurred.
Then he began to tell me about the white horse. And he says, the white horse will come. This is very, very, very important. He says, I saw the white horse. He says, this was an open vision, like a movie screen before me. And he goes, and the white horse was in a stream of water 4 inches deep. He goes, and there was mad dogs on each side of the stream. He says, and Bob Jones says, he was behind the white horse, steering it. Not directing it, but when it went to the left, to the mad dogs, he would pull it back to the middle of the stream. And he said, there was a man on a board, of which he thought was me, because the white horse was the movement. And he said, there was a man on a board, he goes, it's been crying out for many years. He goes, the Lord himself is going to come down and deliver the man on the board. He said, he's going to deliver you. Now, he's misinterpreting the vision. He did not understand. I was not the man on the board, but he thought that I was. He says, one day, suddenly from heaven, he said, I saw Jesus descend, took the man on the whiteboard, flipped him into the water, and when he hit those 4 inches of water, the power of God burst forth from this people to the ends of the earth. He says, man, that's a pretty heavy vision. I never heard of visions like that. He says, now let me explain this to you. He goes, the mad dogs on each end. He goes, a rabid dog is a sincere man with false doctrine. These are men who do not know my ways, who will try to influence this movement and destroy it, but they don't know. They will destroy it if they influence it. So the Lord sent me here to keep you free from the rabid dogs. He says, you will stay in the middle of the stream, and the water will stay at 4 inches until the appointed time. For an appointed season, there will be just enough anointing to keep the people right with God. That's all that he's going to give for the first season. He says, but when he comes down and answers you, because it wasn't me, but he said, when he answers you and flips you into the water will burst forth. You won't have to worry about the rabid dogs anymore. And he goes, and then the move of God will begin.
So that's the white horse prophecy. Or at least, that's how Mike told the story of the white horse prophecy in 1986. And according to this early telling of the story, there are 4 main characters. There's a white horse standing in a shallow stream, which represents the end-time revival movement Mike would lead. There are these rabid dogs on the side of the stream trying to bite the horse, which represents sincere but misguided men who would try to pull the movement in this or that direction outside the will of God. Then there's Bob Jones himself, who's standing behind the horse trying to keep it in the middle of the stream. And then there's a mysterious man on a board crying out to God, who Jones initially assumes to be Mike, but as we'll see in a moment, he quickly changes his mind about that. In any case, Jones saw Jesus descend from heaven, flip the man off the board into the stream, and when the man hit the water, the power of God burst forth from that little group in Kansas City to the ends of the earth. Okay, now keep all of that in mind as we listen to Mike tell the same story 23 years later, in 2009.
He said he saw a white horse in the middle of a dry riverbed. And he went on to describe that this white horse was representing a company of young leaders in the early days. It was those leaders that were involved in this purpose back in 83, 84, 85, that the Lord gave a symbolic picture of them like a white horse. And he said, I saw these white horses. I saw this company of young leaders. And they were in the middle of a river, of a dry riverbed, a little bit of water, about 4 inches. And he said, and there were these mad dogs on each side of the river. And these mad dogs had rabies. And these mad dogs were barking and accusing and wanting to bite them. And the Lord told Bob, your assignment is to keep these young people, this white horse, in the middle of the stream. Keep them focused on me in the middle of the stream, because these mad dogs, he talked about different religious leaders, would accuse them and try to get them into the fear of man and get them into timidity and try to get them to get their eyes off of the Lord. They would say, this is extreme, it's legalism, it's unnecessary, it's not God. And the Lord told Bob, you must keep convincing them, and I will use prophetic revelation that I'll give you, Bob. Convince them how important these things are. They cannot draw back on these things ever. And he said, Bob, this is in 82, he says, the white horse is coming. The white horse is coming. And again, that's this young group of young intercessors in 82 and 83 and 84 that were going to gather together, that Bob was going to meet. And he said, this is a group I'm going to use. And from Bob's point of view, what's happening here is still the white horse. Meaning it's just the continuation of it. 25, 30 years later, it's still the same reality. And he said, Bob said, I saw the young people again. I saw them so many times, maybe 100 times I saw this young adult movement. Beloved, this is your story. This is about you. This has not happened much. A little here, a little there, occasionally, just a little hint of that. This is yet a prophecy to come to pass. The reason this touches me is that the Lord invested so much in this movement. I mean, he was thinking about you. He was thinking about the people that are 20 years old now, and he was thinking about their children when he was setting this thing up. He wasn't thinking about how good ministry would be in Kansas City in the 80s. He was thinking of 2020, 2030, 2040 if the Lord tarries.
So yeah, there are some pretty glaring differences between Mike's 1986 telling of the White Horse prophecy and his 2009 telling of the same story. First of all, there's the expected time of the prophecy's fulfillment. In the 1986 version, we don't get any sense that the time of fulfillment won't come for decades. In fact, we're led to believe the exact opposite, that the great flood of God's end-time revival was about to burst forth right then and there. But in the 2009 version, we get the sense that the prophecy was explicitly aimed at a much later time, and that the intervening decades of delay were foreseen by Bob Jones in the original vision itself. But beyond the expected time of fulfillment, there's also the much more glaring difference concerning one of the main characters of the vision, the mysterious man on the board. The man on the board is absolutely central to the 1986 version, because remember, it's when Jesus descends from heaven and flips the board over and the man falls into the stream that the power of God explodes from Kansas City to the whole world. Whatever the imagery of the man on the board being flipped into the stream means, it's clear that that event is supposed to be the catalyst for the great end-time revival that Mike and his church were praying for. But in the 2009 version, the man on the board is nowhere to be found. We hear about the white horse, the rabid dogs, and Bob Jones standing behind the horse to keep it in the middle of the stream, but not even the faintest echo of the man on the board. And this is the case not only in this version, but in every telling of the White Horse prophecy over the past 20 years or so. As far as I can tell, the man on the board simply doesn't exist. He's just been erased from the story altogether. Why is this? What could possibly explain such a massive redaction? The answer, I think, almost certainly has to do with the identity of the man on the board, or at least with the identity that Bob Jones and Mike Bickle committed to very early on. Remember how Mike said that Bob initially thought that he was the man on the board? Well, that quickly changed, because a few days later, Mike took Bob to meet his family, and he met his younger brother, Pat. Before we get to that meeting, though, there's something very important we need to understand about Pat Bickle, and about Mike's relationship with Pat.
Now, I'm going to put this thing on pause. I'm going to tell you another part of the story that I've never shared this more with 4 people in my life, but it's such a dynamic thing for you to appreciate the seriousness of what's going on, that though it might be, it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to share with you, and very, very uncomely for me to say this, but I've just, for 3 days I've been wrestling with it, and I just thought I'd do what I did when I got up there, and I feel like I want to share this with you, because it's centered around Pat. Is that Pat, when Pat was first broke his neck in 1973, and many of you read about when Pat broke his neck, because it was on the front page of the Kansas City Star 5 or 6 times. It was in the Star at least 10 or 15 times. On the front page, like I said, at least 5 times. He's on the radio, billboards, TV, and an Arrowhead Stadium. They had a big benefit for Pat in '73 when he broke his neck in a high school football game. And so, the Lord sovereignly set him before this city, as most of you that have been here 10 years are well aware of. So what happened is that as he was hurt, I had quit school. I was involved in school at Washington University, and I quit because I wanted to be committed to him. And my father came up to me, and we had a very serious time before the Lord. I have 5 sisters, and Pat and myself, so there's 7 of us in 9 years. As a matter of fact, they're all here. So a lot of you already know a lot of them. And so my father came to me, and he said, this was in October 1973, he said, Mike, we had a very serious time, of which I never shared this with any person. I've only shared this with about 4 people. But the dynamics of this is so incredible about God setting this thing in motion as the reality of in my heart. And he looked at me, he was out in the hallway of the hospital, and he says, he goes, I won't be around forever. He was only 45 years old, and he died of a heart attack 6 months later. But there's obviously no way that anyone could have known that. But he took me in the hallway. He goes, I won't be around forever. And he goes, and your sisters can't take care of him. He goes, I want you to make a covenant before me and before God. Because he didn't even understand all that, but he goes, I know that you love the Lord. He goes, I want you to make a covenant with me that you will take care of him all the days of your life. He said, will you vow that before me and before God right now? He says, because I won't be here forever. And I said, Dad, I'll do that. I make an oath before the Lord I will do that. And the sentence that the Lord gave me, and I said, it will be an easy thing. And my father is the only one who knew this. I said, because it was this new song was out, or I don't know if it was new or whatever, that Neil Diamond song. I said, because he's not heavy, he's my brother, and I love him so much. And I said, I promise I will do that. So now we're back, and so he said, okay, and that was a very private thing that I said in my heart, and I never told anybody. And when I used to pray for him, sometimes I went out and bought that album, and I used to listen to it. And I used to commit myself to him in a way that I never told him or anybody.
The song Mike's referring to here, He Ain't Heavy, He's My Brother, was first recorded by Kelly Gordon in 1969, but it became a worldwide hit when the Hollies released their version later that same year, and it was subsequently covered by everyone from Glenn Campbell and the Osmonds to Cher and Al Green. The version Mike heard, by Neil Diamond, was released on the album Taproot Manuscript in 1970. And when his brother Pat was paralyzed in 1973, Mike swore to his father that he would always take care of Pat by quoting that song. Okay, now that we have that necessary background information, here's what happened a few days after Mike met Bob Jones.
So then a little time comes by, and I said, I wanted Bob Scott and Pat and Diane and a few others to meet this guy. And so I invite him over to the duplexes, And so now I bring him over, and he meets Pat, and Pat says, hey, have you ever seen me? Have you ever seen anything about this? He goes, no. He goes, sorry. He goes, I've never seen you. He goes, boy, he goes, I'll just pray and ask the Lord. He goes, I'd love to get a word and see what God can say to you about being paralyzed.
So that happened a few days after Mike first met Bob Jones on March 7th, when Jones first told Mike about his vision of the white horse. A few days after that, on March 20th, Mike was meeting with a holiness preacher named Art Katz, and Katz asked if they could get together with Bob Jones. So they all ended up meeting together at Mike's house late in the evening on March 20th and into the early morning of March 21st. This is one of the most important moments in Mike's life and the life of the charismatic movement he founded. He tells the story of this night in virtually every version of the prophetic history, because it was the night he became convinced that Bob Jones was indeed a true prophet sent by God. But what Mike doesn't always tell is exactly what Bob Jones told him that night that led him to that momentous conclusion. This is one of several details that make the 1986 version of the prophetic history absolutely indispensable for anyone interested in reconstructing what really happened in those early days, what it meant to that community at the time, and how and why the story changed.
So we're sitting around talking, and what takes place is that Art gives this whole scenario. I mean, he tells Art a bunch of things about his life, and Art says, I don't care what kind of rejection you've received. I'm standing with you. I'll bear your reproach with you because you are a man of God. I went, wow. And then about 12 or 1 in the morning, I can't remember what time, Bob Jones looks at me and goes, oh, by the way, he goes, I forgot to tell you. He says, an angel of the Lord stood before me last night and told me I was a liar. I said, well, what'd you lie about? He says, the young man in the bed over there. He says, your brother. He said, he told me that when Pat asked him, he said, have you ever seen me? He goes, I told your brother no. He goes, an angel of the Lord stood before me and said, the man on the white horse on the board, he said, he's not heavy, he's his brother. And I stood there and I said, and everybody began to weep, and I said, Bob, you have no idea what you've said. He goes, the Lord is going to descend and deliver him. He goes, and the Lord said that this day you would understand. Because he said that sentence, he's not heavy, he's your brother, you would understand. And that was the very covenant that I made before God with my father. And not one person ever knew that. And I said, you are truly of God. I mean, you have no idea what you've just said. You have no idea what you've just said. And he went on and we spent hours. He said, there's a sovereign movement to the ends of the earth. And the Lord gave that very secret of my heart concerning Pat that no man had ever heard to verify it on that hour. So that was March 21st. And I tell you, I was a believer. And though many people could have no way of knowing, there was a tremendous amount of rejection of Bob at first. And people were throwing this and that because this and that, we could have done it different. And they had no idea of the sovereignty of which God set that man in my life.
The man on the board, he's not heavy, he's his brother, and the Lord will descend and deliver him. The words that Mike spoke privately to his father when he committed to take care of Pat, Bob Jones spoke those same words back to him, connecting Pat with the mysterious man on the board in the vision of the white horse, making the vision a promise for Pat Bickle's healing. It's hard to overemphasize just how important this story was, not just to Pat and Mike, but to the life and identity of that whole community. Here's Bob Jones himself explaining the significance of that word in 1988.
One of our main duties when we were being birthed is to pray for Pat Bickle continually. And Mike was an intercessor, and his brother is paralyzed, Pat. And Mike, the intercession that's in him is birthed there by the necessity to pray for his brother. And see, he's saying, my brother's not heavy. He's not a burden to me. He's my brother. I love him. And see, that's the burden that's in this body, that we bear our brother's burdens, that they aren't grievous to him, that he's our brother.
Returning to the 1986 prophetic history, Mike tells 2 further stories related to Pat's healing, and he actually ends the whole thing, which is over 3 hours long, on this really dramatic and emotional note of expectation for Pat's healing. I'm going to share a slightly trimmed down version of those stories here, just for the sake of time, but I've uploaded the entire, unedited 1986 prophetic history on this channel for anyone interested in watching the whole thing. It really is a remarkable piece of history, but I think it's important to at least acknowledge these extra details here so that we can get as full a picture as possible of what the White Horse Prophecy meant in those early years and the wider significance it carried at the time.
Okay, the next event that takes place in our history is October 1984. Thursday night, October 1984, Bob Jones walks into the building, a little prayer meeting, there's probably 20 or 30 of us there, and he gets up and then tells us that a young man, he says, oh, by the way, I got a vision for you. He's talking to everybody. A number, like I said, 20 or 25 or whatever you were there. He said, a young man is going to receive a vision from the Lord very soon. And when this young man has this vision from God, it will lift you off the ground this high with joy. And he said, and the Lord told me, you will hold on to this vision and you will not throw it out. This one you will not let go of like the others. You will hold on to this vision because you will be this high off of the ground with joy. I go home Thursday night, same old thing. Augustine calls again. And his message, bottom line was, God is going to visit your brother Pat openly, and he's going to take him before himself, and he's going to show him that he will heal him. Okay? Thursday night, Bob Jones says, a young man, Thursday night after the prayer meeting, Augustine calls and he wants to communicate this message to me. Friday morning at 4:03 in the morning, Pat's wide awake. He's sitting there, and for 13 minutes he thought he had a dream, but that's because he doesn't understand. And wide awake, everything disappears, and in essence, it was the Holy Spirit. I'll just say the Lord. The Lord appears to him, and in essence tells him, I have come. He told him, I have come. That's all that he said to him, I have come, which means for 12 years, I have not dealt with you on healing, or 10 or 11, whatever that was in October 84. Yes, it's 11 years. I have not dealt with you, but now I am going to begin to deal with this purpose. The fear of God falls on him. He comes out of this trance screaming under the terror of the Lord. He calls me up the next day and says, the fear of God's come. The Lord has told me, I have come. What does it mean? Of course, I know Bob Jones's word, and Augustine already told me. And so the Lord visits Pat in an open way and tells him, I will deliver you. In essence, that's what it comes down to. Before this whole city, God's going to deliver him. Now, in Acts 3, it's interesting to note that in Acts 3, the key miracle that opened up the city of Jerusalem was a paralytic. And how many people came in after the paralytic? 5,000. 5,000. In Acts 14, the city of Lystra, one miracle opened up the entire city. A paralytic in Lystra, and the whole city responded to the Lord. Or not the whole city, but I mean, it caused an uproar and many converts. Not everybody accepted it. The Lord, in his foreknowledge, ordains miracles that open the doors to cities in the gospel. There's not very many times in history where God has opened a city through a miracle. But God has made Pat a sign to this city. 1973. He's in the front page of the newspaper 5 or 6 times, on the radio, on billboards, everywhere. Everybody knows Pat Bickle, a high school athlete, is paralyzed, and he claims, God will deliver me one day. And many of you remember the story. And so that we go to St. Louis for 7 years and come back, and this thing, though it's died in many people's heart, it's alive in Pat's heart, and it's alive in the heart of God. And the Lord says 5,000 will come. And the Lord says, when I lift him up on that day and the waters burst forth, the Son of God will personally come and deliver him. Then one more event, and then we'll be done. The next event is March 1986. I believe it was March. This is the only one I didn't actually record, but I'll get it right. Same thing happens. Pat has another visitation from the Lord. The Lord comes to him in a dream, but this time I understand it was the Lord himself. The Lord stands before him, doesn't say a word. And the Lord turns into Joe McFadder and stands before him. And disappears, and he wakes up the same way. The fear of God comes upon him, and he's just crying out, God, the fear of God falls on him. And he tells his wife, that's on, I believe, a Friday or Thursday, and then Saturday, Sunday come, and Joe gets a song on Saturday for Pat, scared to death to give it. She comes to me on Tuesday and says, I got a song for Pat. Can I sing it? I said, sure, I guess. I had no idea they hadn't shared it with anybody. And Joe comes, and I'm going to have her sing that song in a second, just to end here. And she sings this word. So Pat sees the vision. It's Jesus. He turns into Joe and gives him a message, in essence. I mean, he didn't give it, but it was obviously that was the message. I have a message for you. Joe gets the song a day later or 2 days later and sings it to him. And then we find out later that the Lord stood before him. The power of God falls on Pat. The fear of the Lord is what I mean. And this was a true message for God. God is very interested in Pat. He's very interested. It's something that has nothing to do with even our understanding. He chose him. He advertised him because it pertained to his purposes in these days. And I tell you, the city is going to greatly impact Kansas City when he's delivered. And maybe, obviously there's 1.5 million people. The Lord told us that even our first major increase will only be 5,000, so that's hardly 1/10 of 100%, but it will be the beginning of an impact in this city in a way that we don't fully understand. So Joe now is going to sing the song. I want everybody to close your eyes. This is the prophetic song. This is the word of the Lord that he spoke to Pat.
The central image of the song that follows is of Pat lying on his bed, wondering if his vision was real or if God would delay forever. And the main reprise is the voice of God responding to those doubts in the language of the vision, speaking directly to Pat, saying, I have come, and you will rise. Seeing how central Pat Bickle is to the prophetic history in the 80s, and how important he is to the identity of the community that shared those stories, makes his absence from the more recent versions of that history puzzling, to say the least. When Mike retells the White Horse prophecy today, his younger brother never gets mentioned, because the man on the board doesn't exist. We never hear about the other words God gave to Bob Jones or Augustine Alcala for Pat, or about Pat's 13-minute trance, or about the dream Pat had where God appeared to him and turned into Joanne McFadder, or about the prophetic song God gave to Joanne McFadder a day or two later. And perhaps most significantly of all, whenever Mike tells the story of that fateful night on March 21st, 1983, when he accepted Bob Jones as a true prophet of God, we are never told what Jones said to him that made him a believer. Remember, in the 1986 version, the message Bob Jones gave to Mike that night was explicitly intended as a further revelation concerning the White Horse prophecy, and the sentence Jones gave him, that sentence included a promise for Pat Bickle's healing.
He goes, an angel of the Lord stood before me and said, the man on the white horse on the board, he said, he's not heavy, he's his brother. He goes, the Lord is going to descend and deliver him.
In all the more recent tellings, however, we hear about the angel appearing to Jones.
And he looked at me and he said, the angel of the Lord visited me last night.
We hear about a promise Mike gave to his father just before his father died.
Now, I had made a very special promise to my father when I was 18 years old, and then my father died suddenly of a heart attack.
And we hear about how the angel gave Jones the exact sentence Mike said privately to his father.
I never told anybody, not my wife, anybody, those words.
But we never hear what the sentence was or how it was connected with Pat and the White Horse prophecy.
And he said this, and he told me the sentence.
He told me the promise. And he said, da-da-da-da, and told me the exact sentence.
So what happened? Why would something so central to the prophetic history in the 80s be so thoroughly eradicated from the prophetic history that everyone hears today? Well, for those watching this who didn't already know or haven't already guessed, Pat Bickle did not receive the healing he was promised. Those who knew him say that Pat led an extraordinary life marked by incredible resilience in the face of enormous obstacles. But after facing numerous battles with infections and pneumonia, his lungs finally gave out on May 5th, 2007, and at the age of 50, almost 25 years after Bob Jones told him that God would raise him up as a sign and a wonder before the whole city, Pat Bickle's obituary appeared in the Kansas City Star. So Mike seems to have been faced with a choice. If the prophetic history of this movement was going to live on and inspire a new generation of followers like it had so inspired the old ones, it would have to do so without one of its central characters. Of course, this meant that the very thing that drove Mike to find solace in the words of Bob Jones in the first place, his commitment to his brother, would have to be swept under the rug in order to salvage the grand narrative Bob Jones gave him. But he had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. He could either admit that the prophecies had failed, or he could double down, reinterpret, and selectively remember only those things that reinforced the story he so desperately wanted to believe. And as the wider history of these kinds of movements shows, that wasn't much of a choice.
And I looked at him and I just started weeping. I said, you are a prophet of God.